photos that have been posted of kids going off to school. You've probably seen the signs up now, slow down crosswalk. I know in my commute, which isn't that long, it's about 25% extra because of the traffic that occurs now because of kids going to school. Things are changing. Unfortunately, in America, though, not all kids are going to the same kind of school, same kind of classroom. The debate about the quality of education in America has really risen. I've seen some things recently that are kind of interesting. Now, as you know, 1962 and 1963, two Supreme Court decisions related to prayer in schools started removing it. It occurred. In 1965, the Bible was taken out of schools. And how has education in America gone since then? Down. Better or down? Oh, down, right? In fact, in research conducted recently by the Barna-Frame organization, here's what they said. 7% of U.S. adults, 7% of adults in America say that the education system that we have is very effective. Doesn't sound very good, doesn't it? A mere 1/3 of parents of school-age children, about 34%, say public schools would be their first choice for children. Now, a lot more are using it. In the diagram here, you can see that 46% maintain that public schools have declined even in the last 5 years alone. 26% say maybe they're about the same, and about 15% here say, well, they've maybe made some type of improvement. But nonetheless, as I look at this, I think for us as Americans, particularly as the church, we have an opportunity to respond. Of course, today I'm talking to the choir because you're here, because you're already committed to interacting with children. The reality is we need a lot more people who are willing to share God's message of hope. Well, when I introduced last year the 4-chapter gospel, kind of the big picture way of taking this and kind of bringing it down to 4 key headings, I shared this and gave you perspective. Now we want to dig into it this year a little bit deeper. Today I'm still just staying right at the top. You know, what I've seen though, as we look back in recent years, the evangelical church, and if I could use that phrasing for us today, the evangelical church really has focused on 2 key aspects, 2 key chapters, kind of chapter 2 and chapter 3. Chapter 2 has to do with the fall. This is where we talk about what went wrong. The world has problems. You know, Genesis 3, Adam and Eve led us into sin, and now Romans 5:12, hey, because sin came into the world through one man, now all have sinned. We've all been born with sin, and thus we're separated with God. Then the 3rd chapter is the rescue. Well, Jesus loved us so much, He died, and He came to save us. What these 2 chapters alone have done is they've given us kind of the central kind of key aspect of the message, but they've given it to us without any context. Here's what has happened a lot for students. There's a very unique, interesting phrase that's been coined by some people who've studied youth ministry. They call it this, MTD, which is short for moralistic therapeutic deism. That's a big phrase, and here's what it means. It's about feel-good faith. It's as if Jesus came and died just for me, which in a sense is very true, but not in context. He died for me, so it can be very easily all about me. Let me ask you a question. Do you think students in America have an issue with self-centeredness right now? Yeah. And this all about faith where it's out of context can promote this trouble. Let me share a story for you. We had a young man come to camp a couple years ago. His name was Chris. Chris came to know the Lord, heard that, hey, there's a problem. There's sin. He's got this problem. He needs Jesus. Seemed great. Seemed like a perfect fix for his problems. Thus, he gave his life to the Lord and everything is going to be better, right? It's kind of what he thought. He goes home. Shortly after being home, finds out his parents are getting divorced. Wait a minute. I thought Jesus died for me. I thought everything was going to get better. So things kind of started spiraling for him. It's like he said, well, this faith isn't really working, kind of set it to the side. But he didn't have the big picture context. Thankfully, a conversation further ensued in which staff member was able to help him see kind of the rest of the picture, to see his part in it, and then things started making sense. So why is context very important? Well, context is important for everything, isn't it? If we don't have the whole story, it's hard to really understand it. So this is why we need to have all chapters. So what is the first chapter? It's the creation. Creation, and many of our students don't have this. We live in a culture now where it's not being taught in schools. In fact, my daughter, last Wednesday night, I had taken my kids to youth group. As we passed the school, my daughter says to me, "Oh, hey, by the way, Dad, I just want you to know I used to have a tail." I said, "What? A tail?" "Oh, yeah. I learned it." She's in biology now. "I learned in biology class that we used to have tails." And, so we're kind of talking back and forth about this, and I'm trying to imagine what mine would have looked like. I mean, how many of you, have had tails, early, and you just kind of grew out of them? But, I mean, in all seriousness, her teacher is explaining that we used to have tails. Do you believe this? Well, a lot of the kids in her class did. In her case, she grew up in a family in which she had context. Understanding that God's the creator of all is huge. But if we don't understand that God created this, if that God's the one who's designed this, it doesn't bring the rest easier. How many of you have ever been to the Grand Canyon? Any of you ever been there? It's amazing. Just a beautiful expanse that we have seen there. Amazing. You just look down and you just see these great caverns. Well, several years ago, I was there for the first time, and we're listening to one of these park rangers kind of explaining the canyon. And then he's talking about all of these kind of side canyons that developed as well. And somehow, the question was asked, well, how do these canyons get developed? Well, these big rainstorms kind of came and just dumped rain, and then the canyons developed. Really? I find this kind of interesting. So I asked him, I said, "Can you tell me, have we had any more canyons develop recently?" "Oh, there haven't been any more." "Well, have you had any rainstorms?" I mean, it's just kind of, poor guy, and but sometimes some of this stuff just doesn't go all the way through. But this guy obviously had a presupposition that these things had evolved and millions and millions of years ago and kind of developed. And when you have to have that way, sometimes you have to have some faulty thinking to allow this stuff to come about. But kids need to understand that God has created all this, and then we can talk about the fall and what God's original design was. Then we can help them understand what went wrong. And then, of course, if they can see this, then Jesus being the part of this, Jesus being the answer, is that much more significant. And then, so what do we do? Well, there's two key things when we think about the restoration. The key things have to do with, first, what am I supposed to do? How is it that I'm supposed to be a restorer? Mark 16:15, we're told to go into all the world and preach the good news. We are supposed to join him, and we have the opportunity to join him and do this. And so it's this part of what I get to do, and then it's this part of where we get to be. And Revelation 25 gives us this idea of the new heaven and the new earth. The good news is that this year our curriculum has been designed for the first several lessons to incorporate these 4 chapters into there. And what I'd like to give you some clues is how, as listeners and teachers, is to make sure we can help children start engaging with this. So how do we do this as listeners? How do we help them understand this biblical worldview? Number one, I would say, is make sure to help children connect their daily life to one of the 4 chapters. If they've come in and they've recently had some tragedy, if they've had some suffering or brokenness, help them think about where this fits into oh yeah, well, you know what? Scripturally, suffering is going to happen. God says this, and here's why. Help them start connecting these types of things. If they're coming in and they've recently gotten some evolution stuff, or maybe they're starting to see about creation, help them to see, yeah, this is how God has designed it. Maybe they're struggling with, well, things aren't very good in this world. How could God be God if things aren't very good? Yeah, you know what, God, here's how God designed it. He designed it perfectly, but then we know that Adam and Eve, they had a choice and it fell, and since that time, sin has been in the world. And here's what I find kind of interesting. God gets blamed for all the bad stuff, right? And luck gets blamed for the good stuff. Sometimes we need to help people dialogue and think through this. I'll never forget having a conversation with someone about this once. We had an exchange student in our home, and he continued to blame God for everything that went bad, and talked about all the good luck that he'd have when things went well. And I can remember saying to him, it seems to me that anytime something goes bad, you blame God, and anytime it's good, it seems lucky. I said, why can't you think the other way? It was as if it never occurred to him before. You've probably interacted with people like this, who God gets blamed for the bad stuff. But we can begin starting to help children think about this biblically. The second thing I'd like you to encourage you to ask children to see how this situation could fit into the context of the 4 chapters. They're going to start seeing this regularly and start helping them see where it is. So not only are we going to connect life to it, but we want to help them engage with, all right, so where is this? Maybe they start realizing, I have a friend who's not doing well. Oh, as a restorer, how can you help them? What are things that you can do to bring restoration to them? See, this is especially significant. I talked about the MTD, the moralistic therapeutic deism, kind of the feel-good gospel. If someone's stuck in this feel-good gospel, we need to help them kind of see the bigger picture. We need to help them see that, yes, although God did die for me, it wasn't that He died for me just so I could do whatever I wanted to do. He died for me so that I could be part of His ultimate plan to bring restoration to the earth. God called me to be a reconciler. He's appointed me to go. The Great Commission, right? The Great Commission applies to all of us. That we're to go and preach the gospel everywhere. That's part of our reconciliation plan. That's part of doing this. Because it's easy to take this gospel out of context. I'd say specifically, help them see, we're just looking at the first one here. I thought I had this fixed, but it's not working now. But just look at the first point here. Help them see that God's design was for this world to be good. Now this is a point that we're going to have to talk over and over again. God created it good. He created it in perfection. This is the first chapter of the gospel. And we got to get this first before we get other things. God designed this. God created this. There's a variety of different ministries out there that really can help you get a further handle on creation. And we don't need to know all the details of it. If you're interested, Ken Ham does a daily podcast. Just shares about 45 seconds of good truth. That's really helpful. He's with Answers in Genesis, the Creation Museum. Because if someone doesn't understand creation, it's going to affect the rest of their worldview. Some of you may have heard of Richard Dawkins. He's kind of the evolutionary biologist from Great Britain. Here's what he said just recently. He is quoted as saying, "It is immoral not to abort a fetus if you know they have Down syndrome." This is what comes from his worldview. Why is this? Well, because people think that people with disabilities do not have a future. They don't have a good future, and if it's all about us being happy. Incidentally, a survey was recently done of people with Down syndrome. One of the questions asked, are you happy? 99% of them said they're happy. Do you believe this? But currently, 95% of all Down syndrome babies are born in our culture. Currently 95%. And see, that's what not believing in God's perfect plan has done. Secondly, I would say, this is the bottom part, help them see where the chapter, where the current passage fits. So if we're teaching from somewhere in the Bible, help them kind of see where it fits in the big picture. If I gave you a map, and you didn't know where you were starting, and you didn't know where you were going, I just gave you a couple roads, and I said, drive on these things, some of you would probably drive. You know what I'm saying? Because some of you just wouldn't understand a map anyways. But some of you would never want to leave if you didn't really know where you were and where you were going, because you just know we need to get somewhere. Sometimes we'll take children to the Bible and they won't really see the context of the scripture that we're given. And we don't need to spend time, a huge amount of time doing this. One of the things that I've started doing is, particularly I teach, whether it be children or if I teach at some of the Christian schools in our area, I always want to help introduce the chapters. So if I'm speaking kind of on Jesus and what He's come to do for us, I want to make sure they get chapter 1 and 2 before I spend my focus on 3, and then I want to point them to 4 at the end. You know what I'm saying for giving the context? I don't need to say, now, chapter 1, chapter 2, but I want to give them this context so they can see how things fit together. For me, it wasn't until I went to seminary and had systematic theology that I started seeing how things kind of fit together. Because before that, I had piecemeal. And what I think sometimes is, if I were to go into the average church, and I visit a lot of them, and I went to this Bible study or that Bible study or this Bible or that Bible study, what view would I have of the whole palette of God? You know what I'm saying? So this is really helpful for them. The context too, because when you see the whole context, we can see how redemption and restoration fits into here. How Jesus is rescued. Because sometimes there's a tendency, let's say we're teaching about Daniel, and Daniel's thrown into the lion's den because Daniel's protected them because Daniel did good things. It's easy sometimes, especially in teaching with children, to reduce the scriptures just to a bunch of behavioralistic commands. And God's not really interested in behaviors, although that's very important. He's mostly interested in the heart, right? What does he say? Some look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Because here's what we know about the heart. If the Lord's got the heart, if the affections of the heart are tuned towards the Lord, the behaviors are going to follow. Why are so many kids leaving the church? Because their heart's not with the Lord. Like they might be doing the behaviors, and they might be doing the behaviors one way in front of some people and one way in front of others. I mean, how many of you know we'd much rather want the hearts? Because if you point to your own spiritual growth, in fact, you can see that it's when your heart was finally grabbed that you really started pursuing the Lord. And so giving this context really helps take their hearts and turns them to the Lord. So let's just make sure, too, that we're also pointing out, hey, sin is part of the fall. Now, this is chapter 2, right? We know we want to live our own way. We know God desires us to follow a plan. Hey, like this is the big third chapter of the Bible, that like sin is there and it's having an impact. Of course, we always want to point them to Jesus as the answer. Like this is the man who lived the perfect life. He came, died so that we could receive forgiveness of our sin. He is the one who does this. We can receive His power as we pray and as we seek forgiveness. And what we want to make sure we're doing with these students is regularly just being so sensitive to the Spirit and just offering to them this gift of eternal life. We don't need to wait for the salvation message. Like as we're going through these chapters and helping them to see the context, the worst thing we could do is say, well, you know what, you're going to have to wait till next week, right? And unfortunately, I've heard stories that that's happened at times. At any time, just be ready to help them see. And this is just the third chapter. Now the fourth chapter points to this fact that we want to... Got that again, do we? Well, okay, I got the wrong ones in there. You're going to have to believe me on these next two. We want to help them see that they are to be restorers. But what does this mean? They're to be part of God's plan of restoring this fallen world into this new heaven and the new earth. What does this mean? Well, we're fulfilling the Great Commission, right? We're looking to be bringers of healing and peace in other areas. Like these kids, they're key, if it's simply started by handing out a permission form, but they're key messengers in bringing the gospel. They're the ambassadors. They are the ones to... This is the responsibility He's given to us. It's not just the pastor. It's not just the missionary. It's all of us that He has called to be part of this plan. And finally, again, one more on the fourth point, is just to keep pointing to the hope of eternity spent in heaven. One day, God will make all things right.